Picture the word mad emperor, and your brain probably serves up a purple-robed lunatic feeding senators to lions for fun. But the real Rome hiding underneath that cartoon is stranger, colder, and far more human than the legend ever let on. Over the next 20 reigns, we're going to walk through poison plots, palace informants, burning cities, and a horse that may or may not have been made a senator, but we're doing it the hard way, holding every shocking claim up against who actually wrote it down, whether it was a contemporary eyewitness, a hostile biographer settling scores decades later, or a downright fabricated legend dressed up as fact, using the likes of Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, and the wildly unreliable Historia Augusta as our built-in lie detectors. We'll talk cruelty, paranoia, political terror, and naked abuse of power. But we won't be slapping modern psychiatric labels on men who died 1,000 years before psychiatry existed. So here's the real question haunting this whole journey. From a brooding Julio Claudian recluse on Capri to a blood-soaked usurper crowning himself 7 centuries later, were these men truly monsters, or did Rome's own machinery of fear and gossip build the monsters for them? Settle in, because this is a slow burn, evidence-first descent into the most terrifying thrones in ancient history, told at a steady, sleep-friendly pace, one verified horror at a time. Picture the scene historians love to sell you. A marble palace on the Palatine Hill, torches guttering in the night wind, and somewhere down a mosaic hallway, an emperor in a bathrobe is deciding which senator dies before breakfast. That is the postcard version of Imperial Rome, the one where every Caesar is a giggling maniac feeding relatives to exotic animals for fun. It is a great story. It is also, most of the time, a wildly oversimplified one. Here is the uncomfortable truth we are going to sit with for this entire series. Some Roman emperors really were monstrous. Paranoid, violent, casually murderous in ways that would get a modern head of state dragged in front of an international court before lunch. But others earned their reputation for cruelty the same way a modern politician earns a scandal, through enemies who outlived them and controlled the pen afterward. Rome did not have a free press. It had senators with grudges, historians with patrons, and biographers writing decades or even centuries after the bodies were already cold. So before we start ranking 20 of the most feared names in Roman history by how close they got to outright psychopathy, we need to talk about who is doing the talking, because that is the real hook of this whole investigation. It is not just what these men did, it is who wrote it down, why they wrote it, and what they stood to gain by making a dead emperor look like a monster. Start with Suetonius, the gossip columnist of the ancient world. Except his gossip column became one of the most influential biographical works ever written. He served in the imperial administration under Hadrian, which meant he had access to archives, letters, even palace scuttlebutt. But he also had an appetite for the scandalous detail that makes a scroll fly off the shelf. Suetonius is the reason we picture Caligula threatening to make his horse a consul. He is vivid, quotable, and occasionally about as reliable as a tabloid headline. Fantastic for atmosphere, risky for hard fact. Then there is Tacitus, sharper, more political, deeply suspicious of concentrated power, because he watched what unchecked emperors did to the Senate class he belonged to. Tacitus writes with real literary genius, but he is also settling scores on behalf of an aristocracy that despised the very institution of one-man rule. When Tacitus tells you an emperor is cruel, you have to ask whether the emperor was cruel to Rome or just cruel to senators like Tacitus. Cassius Dio gives us a different angle entirely, a Greek-speaking senator writing generations later, working from earlier sources that have since vanished, sometimes preserving details nobody else bothered to record, sometimes repeating rumors that had already calcified into fact through decades of retelling. And then, sitting at the far end of the reliability spectrum, we have the Historia Augusta. This is the wild card of ancient biography, a collection of imperial lives written by authors whose identities remain genuinely disputed, packed with sensational anecdotes that modern historians treat with enormous suspicion. Some of it is probably grounded in real sources now lost to us, Some of it reads like ancient fan fiction with a body count. Throughout this series, whenever a claim traces back primarily to the Historia Augusta, we are going to flag it, because a shocking quote from this text carries a very different evidentiary weight than something confirmed by an inscription or a contemporary letter. That is the method here. Not blind trust, not blanket dismissal, but a running habit of asking, is this contemporary evidence? Is this later hostile biography? Or is this just legend that grew in the retelling? Every single emperor on our list gets that treatment. Now, how exactly do we measure something as slippery as psychopathic behavior in men who ruled 2,000 years ago? We are not going to hand out modern psychiatric diagnoses like party favors. Nobody on this list is getting slapped with a clinical label based on second-hand Latin prose written after they were already dead and buried. That would be bad history dressed up as science. Instead, this series works off 5 observable patterns that show up again and again in the record. Patterns any modern viewer will recognize instantly, even stripped of clinical jargon. Cruelty, meaning a documented willingness to inflict suffering beyond what politics or war required. Paranoia, the kind that turns a ruler against his own family, his own guards, his own shadow. Violence, especially violence used as spectacle rather than necessity. Political terror, the deliberate cultivation of fear as a tool of control. And abuse of power, bending the machinery of the state toward personal appetite rather than public function. Every emperor gets weighed against those 5 markers using the strongest evidence available, and we will always tell you when the evidence is thin. Because here is the twist that makes this more interesting than a simple villain countdown. Sometimes the emperor with the worst reputation had comparatively modest documented cruelty, just excellent enemies. And sometimes the emperor history barely remembers as monstrous did things that would make your skin crawl, but simply lacked a Tacitus or a Suetonius willing to make it legendary. So who is actually on this roster? We are covering 20 emperors spanning roughly 7 centuries of Roman rule, and the range is the point. We open in the shadow of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the founding family of the empire, whose later generations produced rulers so notorious that their names became permanent shorthand for imperial excess. From there we move through the chaos of the Year of the 4 Emperors into the Flavian and Antonine periods, where things occasionally calm down just enough to remind you that stability was possible, and then into the 3rd century crisis, an era so violent that emperors were dying faster than the mints could strike coins in their honor. Along the way we will spend real time with Caracalla, the son of Septimius Severus, who ruled jointly with his father, starting in 198 and then alone after 211, until his own assassination in 217 near Carrhae. Caracalla is a textbook case for our entire method, because the record on him is genuinely damning and comes from multiple angles at once. He had his own brother Geta murdered, reportedly in their mother's arms, to eliminate a rival claim to the throne. He purged Geta's supporters afterward in a wave of killings meant to erase any competing loyalty. And yet this is also the emperor who issued the Constitutio Antoniana, extending citizenship far more broadly across the empire, and who was formally deified by the Senate after his death. A strange kind of vindication for a man remembered mostly for cruelty. Caracalla shows us exactly why this series refuses easy verdicts, because brutality and political achievement sat side by side in the same reign, sometimes in the same year. We will also travel forward into the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, eventually landing on a 7th century usurper whose path to power was soaked in blood from the very first day, closing the loop on a thread that runs unbroken from the earliest tyrants of the Julio-Claudian line all the way to the empire's final violent centuries. The through line connecting all 20 names is simple. Power without restraint tends to reveal character, for better and for worse, and Rome handed out an extraordinary amount of unrestrained power over an extraordinary length of time. As for tone, this is not going to be a shouting match or a highlight reel of gore for its own sake. Expect steady, measured narration built for long listening, the kind of pacing that works whether you are watching closely or letting it play in the background as you drift towards sleep. We are not here to rush you through shock value. We are here to walk you through evidence, carefully, one rain at a time, letting the facts build their own tension rather than manufacturing it with cheap tricks. Every claim that sounds too outrageous to be true will get a source check right there in the narration. If something comes primarily from the Historia Augusta, you will hear that. If something is confirmed independently by inscriptions, coinage, or multiple contemporary writers, you will hear that too. That is the promise underlying this entire series. The Roman world produced real horror and real heroism, often from the same men, and separating the two honestly is far more interesting than any myth could ever be. 20 reigns, 7 centuries, one running question: just how far did power push these men, and how much of what we think we know is actually true? Picture a man who spent decades proving himself as one of Rome's most capable generals, campaigning in Germany, pacifying the Balkans, earning the kind of battlefield respect that soldiers do not hand out lightly. And then picture that same man ending his life as a recluse on a cliffside island, refusing to even set foot in the city he ruled. That whiplash is Tiberius in a single glance, and it is exactly why he makes such a fascinating second stop on this journey. He was not born to rule, he was maneuvered into it, adopted late by Augustus almost as a last resort after death had picked off every preferred candidate one by one, and he seems to have known it. Contemporaries describe a man who did not campaign for the throne so much as get cornered by it, and that reluctance never really left him. The soldier who once marched confidently through hostile territory became an emperor who visibly recoiled from the spotlight, and Rome, ever suspicious of anyone who did not seem hungry enough for power, took that recoil as something sinister rather than something human. Now, reluctant or not, Tiberius inherited a legal weapon that would define his reputation for the next 2,000 years, and it is called the Master's Law. On paper, Masters was about protecting the dignity of the Roman state, and by extension, the emperor who embodied it. In practice, under Tiberius, it became something closer to a loaded gun left lying around the Senate floor, and everyone with a grudge eventually picked it up. Insulting the emperor, even in a private letter, even in a joke told at a dinner party, could now be spun into treason. And here is where the real horror show begins. Because it was not Tiberius personally hunting down every offender. It was everyone else doing it for him. Senators informed on senators. Rivals informed on rivals. Professional accusers, the infamous delatores, made entire careers out of digging up loose words and turning them into capital charges, because Roman law offered a cut of the condemned man's property to whoever successfully prosecuted him. Suddenly, accusing your neighbor of treason was not just political revenge, it was a business model. Tacitus, writing decades later with a very specific axe to grind, paints Tiberius as the architect of this climate of fear. But look closer at the mechanics, and you see something almost more disturbing than a single tyrant barking orders. You see an entire class of ambitious Romans discovering that cruelty had a price tag, and that the price was very much worth paying. And if you want the single clearest proof of how paranoid this system could get, you do not need to look any further than a man named Sejanus. He started as the commander of the Praetorian Guard, a role that was basically the emperor's personal security detail, and through sheer competence and relentless networking, he became Tiberius's most trusted advisor. For years, Sejanus was effectively running Rome while Tiberius grew more withdrawn, consolidating the guard into a single camp just outside the city walls, positioning loyalists in key posts, marrying into the right families, and generally making himself look less like a bodyguard and more like an heir apparent. Then, in the year 31, it all came apart in what might be one of the most dramatic political reversals in Roman history. Tiberius, from the safety of his island retreat, sent a letter to the Senate. It started ordinary enough, droning through routine business, and then, almost as an afterthought near the end, it turned on Sejanus completely, accusing him of plotting against the imperial family. The Senate, sensing the wind change in real time, had Sejanus arrested and executed that same day. His body was thrown down the Gemonian stairs, the traditional dumping ground for disgraced traitors, and then his own children were killed in the purge that followed. Because in Rome, guilt by association was not a legal technicality, it was standard procedure. The Sejanus affair tells you everything about how Roman court politics actually worked under Tiberius. Power was never stable, loyalty was never permanent, and the closer you stood to the emperor, the further you might eventually fall. Which brings us to Capri, the island Tiberius retreated to in 26, and never really left for the rest of his reign, ruling an empire of millions from a rocky outcrop in the Bay of Naples. What we actually know from the more careful ancient sources is fairly restrained. Tiberius withdrew from public appearances, delegated administration through letters and trusted officials, and seems to have genuinely preferred isolation to the theatre of Roman public life. That alone was scandalous enough by Roman standards, because an emperor who removed himself from the Senate and the Forum was an emperor who left a vacuum, and vacuums in Roman politics tend to fill with rumour. But then Suetonius gets his hands on the story, writing decades after the fact with a clear appetite for scandal, and Capri transforms from a quiet retirement villa into something out of a fever dream, filled with lurid tales of orgies, sadistic games, and cruelty dressed up as entertainment. Some of this may contain a kernel of truth, much of it reads like exactly what it probably is: salacious gossip laundered into biography, the kind of thing that spreads easily precisely because nobody on Capri was around to contradict it, and dead emperors make excellent scapegoats for stories nobody can verify. The tension here is not really about what happened on that island, it is about how thin the line is between a genuinely troubling historical account and a piece of ancient tabloid journalism that got mistaken for fact because it was written in Latin instead of clickbait. So how do we weigh all of this against each other? The calculating tyrant of Tacitus against the isolated administrator the paperwork actually shows us. Tacitus wants you to see a man consumed by suspicion from the very start. Someone whose entire reign was one long exercise in hidden malice finally let loose once Augustus's shadow faded. And there is real substance behind that portrait. The Maesters' trials happened. The informers thrived. Sejanus really did rise and fall in a single letter's worth of betrayal. But step back and look at the empire itself during these same years, and you find something that does not fit neatly into the monster narrative. The provinces were largely stable, the treasury, by most accounts, was carefully managed rather than plundered. Frontiers held. Administrative correspondence continued flowing out of Capri with the same bureaucratic diligence you would expect from any competent if distant ruler. This is the uncomfortable puzzle sitting at the center of Tiberius's reign. A man remembered as a paranoid, secretive tyrant also somehow ran a functioning, largely peaceful empire for over 2 decades. And those two facts are not easy to reconcile if you are looking for a simple villain. Maybe the truth is that Tiberius was never quite the monster Tacitus needed him to be. But he also was not some innocent victim of bad press either. He built a legal machine that rewarded betrayal. He let a single advisor gather terrifying amounts of power before crushing him without warning. And he retreated from Rome in a way that left just enough silence for the worst rumors to fill in the blanks. Whether that makes him psychopathic in any real sense, or simply a deeply guarded man who never wanted the job in the first place and grew colder the longer he was forced to keep it, is exactly the kind of question this series is built to sit with rather than answer too quickly. And as we are about to see with the next emperor on our list, Tiberius's brand of quiet, bureaucratic paranoia was about to look almost gentle by comparison. Picture Rome breathing a sigh of relief. Tiberius is dead, the old recluse finally gone from his cliffside fortress on Capri, and the crowds are practically dancing in the streets because the new guy, young Gaius, nicknamed Caligula since he was a toddler stomping around army camps in tiny soldier boots, seems like a breath of fresh air. He is charming. He is generous. He opens the granaries, throws games, pardons exiles, and for about 6 months Rome genuinely believes it has dodged a bullet. Then he gets sick. Some historians think it was meningitis, others whisper about poison. But whatever it was, the man who walked out of that sickbed was not the same man who walked in. The charm did not vanish overnight, but something underneath it curdled, and the empire was about to learn that a young man handed absolute power, absolute wealth, and 0 real checks on his behavior is basically a psychological experiment nobody signed up for. Let's talk about the horse. Everybody knows the horse. Caligula supposedly made his favorite stallion, Incitatus, a Roman consul, gave the animal a marble stable, an ivory manger, a retinue of servants, and reportedly invited him to state dinners like some kind of four-legged senator. It is the single most repeated fact about this emperor, the go-to punchline whenever someone wants to illustrate absolute power curdling into absolute absurdity. And here is the uncomfortable twist for anyone who loves a good punchline. The actual ancient evidence is thinner than the story deserves. Suetonius mentions the horse's lavish treatment, sure, but the leap to made him an actual consul is largely a later flourish, an exaggeration stacked on an exaggeration until it hardened into common knowledge. Was Caligula flaunting wealth on an animal to humiliate the Senate symbolically? Probably. Did he literally hand a horse a toga and a voting seat? Almost certainly not. But notice what just happened, because this is going to be the pattern for this entire chapter. Underneath nearly every unbelievable Caligula story sits a kernel of real documented behavior, and then a mountain of embellishment piled on top of it by writers who had every reason to make him look as insane as possible. Take the incest accusations, specifically the claims involving his sister Drusilla. Suetonius reports it as established fact, practically gossip passed along with a shrug. And later writers ran with it because it fit the emerging portrait of an emperor who recognized no boundaries, divine or otherwise. But strip away the confident tone, and what you are left with is a single hostile source, writing decades after the fact, with zero corroborating documentation, no trial record, no contemporary letter, nothing but assertion dressed up as history. That does not mean it is false. It means we genuinely cannot know, and any documentary that tells you otherwise with total confidence is selling certainty it does not actually have. What we can say is that Caligula elevated Drusilla to extraordinary honors after her death, deified her, which was politically strange and personally intense by Roman standards. But strange and intense is not the same thing as proven incest. Then there is the godhood question, probably the most quoted proof that Caligula had genuinely lost his grip on reality. The story goes that he declared himself a living god, demanded temples, insisted senators grovel before his divine presence. Again, real behavior sits underneath this. He did commission a temple to himself, did have his image placed alongside statues of major deities, did lean into divine associations far more aggressively than any emperor before him. Rome's relationship with imperial divinity was already complicated. Augustus had been deified after death. Provincial cults sometimes worshipped living emperors as a form of political flattery. Caligula's innovation was doing it loudly, doing it while still breathing, and doing it in Rome itself, rather than tucked safely away in some distant province where nobody with real political weight had to genuflect. That is not the behavior of a stable political operator. It is arrogance with teeth, a direct provocation aimed at an aristocracy that still liked to pretend the emperor was merely first among equals, rather than a walking deity. Whether he actually believed himself divine, or was cynically weaponizing divinity to terrify the Senate into submission, is a question historians still argue about, and honestly, it might not even matter, because either version ends with the same result, a Senate that increasingly saw this young man as a threat rather than a leader. Because here is the real story hiding beneath the mythology, the part that rarely gets its own highlight reel because it is less fun than a horse in a toga. Caligula's actual political core was a slow-motion collision with Rome's elite. He executed senators on thin pretexts, seized property from wealthy citizens to refill a treasury he had personally drained through wild extravagance, staged elaborate public spectacles and construction projects that dazzled crowds while horrifying anyone who understood Roman accounting. He reportedly built a temporary floating bridge of ships across the Bay of Baiae, just to ride across it on horseback, a stunt with no military or political value beyond pure theatre, financed by money that could have gone toward literally anything else. This is where the psychology gets genuinely interesting, because it suggests less a coherent tyrant with a master plan, and more a young man testing the outer limits of what unlimited power would let him get away with, escalating because nothing ever stopped him, because nobody with the authority to say no actually said it. And that lack of resistance matters enormously, because absolute power without institutional pushback does not just permit cruelty, it actively incubates it. Every executed senator, every confiscated estate, every arbitrary insult hurled at Rome's oldest families taught the aristocracy the same lesson over and over. There was no reasoning with this man, no appealing to precedent or law or shared class loyalty, because Caligula simply did not operate on that frequency anymore. Fear does not stay quiet forever. It calcifies into calculation, and by the early 40s CE, that calculation had a name, a location, and a very specific weapon. The Praetorian Guard, the same elite unit theoretically sworn to protect the emperor's life, became the instrument of his death. In January of 41 CE, officers within the Guard, reportedly acting partly out of personal grievance and partly out of broader institutional fear, ambushed Caligula in a palace corridor and stabbed him to death, along with his wife and young daughter shortly after. This was not a distant senatorial conspiracy hatched in whispered toga meetings. It was the emperor's own protection detail, deciding he had become more dangerous alive than any external threat he claimed to be guarding against. Think about what that says. When the people paid specifically to keep you breathing decide murder is the safer bet, you have crossed some invisible threshold that most tyrants, even genuinely brutal ones, manage to avoid. So why does Caligula remain the eternal shorthand for tyranny, the name people reach for whenever they want to describe absolute power gone completely feral? Partly it is because the stories are just irresistibly vivid. A horse consul, a self-declared god, whispers of incest, all wrapped in a 4-year reign short enough to feel like one continuous fever dream rather than a slow grinding tyranny stretched across decades. Compare that to someone like Tiberius, whose damage was bureaucratic and slow burning, built on legal machinery and paranoid patience. Caligula's alleged monstrosity, real or exaggerated, comes packaged in instantly quotable, wildly cinematic anecdotes that survive the centuries far better than dry administrative cruelty ever could. Rome's later historians, writing under emperors eager to distance themselves from the Julio-Claudian mess, had every incentive to paint him as the most degenerate version imaginable, because a monstrous predecessor makes whoever comes next look like a stabilizing improvement by comparison. But separate the shock value from the substantiated cruelty, and what you get is still genuinely troubling, just in a quieter register than the legend suggests. A young man handed total power at 24, hit by illness or trauma that may have altered his temperament in ways we cannot fully diagnose from 2,000 years away, who escalated from popular reformer to reckless, financially ruinous, senator-executing threat within a shockingly short window, and who ultimately died because the very institution built to protect him decided he had become the danger. You do not need the horse consul or the incest rumors to find that disturbing. The verified behavior alone, the executions, the extravagance, the open contempt for the Senate's dignity, does plenty of work on its own. Caligula did not need to be a god-declaring, horse-promoting maniac to earn his place in this list. He just needed to be a frightened, indulged, unchecked young man who discovered that nothing in Rome could stop him, right up until 4 men with knives proved otherwise. Look at how quickly the pattern repeats itself once you start checking. Caligula was not an aberration in Roman history so much as a preview, a rough draft that later emperors would revise, polish, and in some cases genuinely outdo. The Senate that killed him told itself a comforting story afterward, that the problem had been one uniquely broken man, that the system itself was sound and simply needed a better steward at the wheel. That story lasted almost exactly 1 generation before it fell apart again, spectacularly, in an arena built specifically so an emperor could watch men die for entertainment while calling it civic virtue. Picture the son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor whose writings on Stoic restraint are still assigned in university seminars, and then picture that same bloodline producing a teenager who would rather fight lions personally than read his father's meditations on duty. That contrast alone tells you almost everything about how fast Roman power could curdle across a single generation. Commodus inherited an empire at peace, a treasury in reasonable shape, and a senate that expected, reasonably, another few decades of competent philosopher-king governance. Instead, they got a young man who renamed Rome after himself, renamed the months of the calendar after his own titles, and insisted on being addressed as the reincarnation of Hercules while descending into the Colosseum sands to slaughter animals that had been deliberately maimed or restrained beforehand, so the emperor's kill would look heroic rather than embarrassing. That last detail matters more than it sounds. This was not bravery dressed up as spectacle. It was theatre, stage-managed cowardice performed as divine strength, and the senators forced to sit in the front rows and applaud understood exactly what they were watching. Some of them reportedly kept laurel leaves in their mouths during his gladiatorial appearances, chewing on the bitter leaves to keep their faces from betraying the horror or amusement they actually felt, because visible reaction of either kind could get a man executed on the spot. Imagine sitting through hours of a deranged emperor's vanity performance, physically biting down on foliage just to keep your expression neutral enough to survive the afternoon. Nobody in Rome expected Claudius to end up wearing the purple. He stuttered, he limped, he drooled when he got excited, and his own family treated him like a piece of furniture nobody wanted to inherit. His mother reportedly called him a monster that nature had started but never finished. His sister apparently prayed that the Roman people would be spared the humiliation of ever seeing him rule. So when the Praetorian Guard dragged him out from behind a curtain after Caligula's assassination, allegedly hiding there in sheer terror, and declared him emperor on the spot, the joke seemed to be on everyone, Claudius included. Except the joke didn't land the way his family expected. Because underneath the twitchy exterior was a man who had spent his entire life being underestimated, which, as it turns out, is excellent training for actually getting things done while nobody's watching closely enough to stop you. Claudius expanded the empire into Britain, reformed the courts, streamlined the bureaucracy, and built infrastructure that outlasted every insult ever thrown at him. He was, by most measures that matter for running an empire, competent, genuinely competent, which complicates the tidy narrative of the drooling fool stumbling into power he couldn't handle, and complicates it in a way ancient historians never fully forgave him for. A capable Claudius was a less entertaining Claudius, and entertainment, unfortunately for accuracy, tends to win. Where the story gets murkier and considerably darker is inside his own household. Claudius married 4 times, and at least 2 of those marriages come wrapped in accusations of manipulation, poisoning, and outright domestic warfare. His 3rd wife, Messalina, gets painted by Roman sources as a woman running a parallel court of scandal and executions behind her husband's back, orchestrating the deaths of rivals while Claudius remained, depending on which historian you trust, either oblivious or complicit. Whether that's accurate reporting or the ancient equivalent of a smear campaign against a powerful woman, is genuinely hard to untangle, and we should say that plainly rather than repeating the gossip as settled fact. Then came his 4th marriage, to his own niece Agrippina the Younger, which required special legal maneuvering just to be legally permissible, and which set the stage for the single most consequential poisoning rumor in Roman imperial history. Claudius died in 54 CE after eating a meal that ancient sources insist was tampered with, allegedly a dish of mushrooms, allegedly at Agrippina's instruction, allegedly timed perfectly to clear the path for her teenage son to inherit the throne instead of Claudius's own biological son Britannicus. Notice how many times the word allegedly needs to appear in that sentence. We don't have a confession, we don't have forensic evidence, we have Roman historians writing decades later with their own agendas and their own appetite for a dramatic ending. What we do have is a suspiciously convenient death and a suspiciously well-prepared successor waiting in the wings. That successor was Nero, and here's where the chapter takes its darkest turn, because Nero did not arrive as a monster, he arrived as a relief. The early years of his reign get genuinely good marks from contemporary sources: low taxes, expanded entertainment for the public, a functioning relationship with the Senate, guidance from capable advisors like the philosopher Seneca. For a moment, Rome had reason to believe the teenage emperor was going to be one of the good ones. Hold on to that image, because it makes what follows so much more disturbing. Nero's mother Agrippina had spent years engineering his rise, and she expected influence in return, the kind of behind-the-throne power that comes from putting your own child on it. Nero had other plans, namely, having none of it. The relationship curdled fast, and by 59 CE, it had curdled all the way into murder. The method historians describe sounds almost absurd in its theatricality. A specially designed collapsible boat meant to sink and drown her at sea, engineered to look like an accident. Agrippina, apparently a stronger swimmer than her son anticipated, survived that attempt and swam to shore, which meant Nero simply sent men to finish the job by more direct means shortly afterward. His own mother, murdered because she wanted a say in the empire she had personally maneuvered him into ruling. Britannicus, Claudius's biological son and Nero's stepbrother, didn't even get the dignity of a dramatic failed attempt. He was reportedly poisoned at a family dinner in 55 CE, dying in convulsions in front of guests who understood immediately what they'd just witnessed, and understood equally immediately that saying so out loud would be a spectacular way to die next. This is the family blood the chapter title is pointing at. A household where poison at the dinner table and staged accidents at sea became the accepted vocabulary of succession planning. And then, in the summer of 64 CE, Rome burned. The Great Fire tore through the city for roughly 6 days, destroying huge sections of it, and the legend that followed insists Nero personally started it to clear land for his own building projects, then fiddled or sang while watching it burn. That specific image, the emperor serenading himself while his city turned to ash, is almost certainly theatre built on top of theatre, a detail later sources embellished because it made such a perfect symbol of imperial indifference. What the more careful ancient accounts actually support is messier and, honestly, still damning enough without the fiddle. Nero was reportedly out of the city when the fire started, returned to organize relief efforts, opened his own gardens to house displaced citizens, and afterward used the newly cleared land to build an enormous personal palace complex, the Domus Aurea, complete with a colossal statue of himself. You don't need arson to see the problem here. An emperor whose city just burned to the ground, who then constructs a monument to his own vanity on the ashes, has told you everything about his priorities without lifting a single match. But rumors needed somewhere to land, and Nero made sure they landed somewhere convenient. He blamed the fire on Rome's small Christian community, and what followed was brutal even by the standards of an empire that treated public execution as entertainment. Christians were reportedly crucified, thrown to animals, and in some horrifying accounts, used as human torches to light Nero's gardens at night. Whether every detail in that description survived intact through centuries of retelling is worth questioning, but the core fact that Nero orchestrated a violent, deliberate scapegoating campaign against a vulnerable minority to deflect blame from himself sits on solid enough ground that it doesn't need embellishment to be horrifying. The final chapter of Nero's reign plays out like a man who never stopped performing even as his empire stopped watching. He fancied himself an artist above all else, singing and competing in Greek-style festivals while provincial governors quietly turned against him and armies began backing rival claimants. By 68 CE, the Senate had declared him a public enemy, his guards had abandoned him, and the man who once commanded the fate of an empire was reduced to fleeing through the countryside with a handful of loyal servants, searching for somewhere, anywhere, to hide. He reportedly ended his own life with assistance, uttering some final self-pitying line about what a great artist the world was losing, which tells you precisely how he wanted to be remembered and precisely how little that request would be honored. Nero's downfall matters beyond the individual tragedy of one deranged emperor eating himself alive with paranoia and vanity. He's the moment Roman political terror stopped being purely about executions and treason trials and became something more intimate, more personal, more theatrical, murder as staged accident, tyranny as performance art, cruelty dressed up in the costume of an artist who genuinely believed his own tragedy was the main event. Rome had seen bad emperors before him. What it hadn't fully seen was an emperor who made his own family's blood into spectacle, and then, at the very end, tried to make his own death into one too. And that's the real inheritance Nero left behind, more corrosive than any single murder. He proved that an emperor could turn grief into theatre, turn matricide into a headline, and still find senators applauding in the front row because their lives depended on the performance landing well. Future Caesars took notes. Some of them took notes obsessively, because once the empire learned that cruelty could be scripted, rehearsed and delivered with a flourish. There was no putting that particular genie back in the bottle. Rome had built an entire political culture on spectacle. Gladiators, triumphs, executions staged like street theatre. And Nero simply extended that logic one horrifying step further, straight into his own living room. Nero's suicide didn't end the crisis. It detonated a brand new one. For the first time in Rome's imperial history, there was no Julio Claudian heir waiting in the wings, no bloodline to fall back on, no dynastic script anyone could follow. The empire had spent nearly a century building its entire political identity around one family tree, and now that tree was a smoking stump. What followed in 69 CE is remembered by historians with a name that sounds almost clinical, the Year of Four Emperors. But calling it that is a bit like calling a car crash a scheduling delay. What actually happened was closer to a full-blown structural failure, the kind that reveals every crack in a building the moment the weight shifts. And the weight, in this case, was an empire suddenly discovering that its throne could be claimed by whoever had the biggest army and the least hesitation about using it. First through the door was Galba, a stern old governor from Spain, who arrived in Rome with all the charm of a strict headmaster showing up to a school that had spent years partying under a negligent principal. And to be fair, Rome kind of needed a headmaster. Nero had left the treasury gutted, and the military bloated with promises he never intended to keep. Galba's answer was discipline, cutting costs, refusing bribes, tightening the purse strings across the board. Sounds responsible, right? Sounds like exactly the adult supervision a chaotic empire actually needed. Sure, except Rome's soldiers hadn't signed up for austerity. They'd been trained under a system where loyalty got rewarded, generously, and Galba's refusal to pay out the donatives he'd basically implied were coming turned him from stern reformer into cheap tyrant almost overnight. He'd been emperor for less than 7 months when the Praetorian Guard, the very soldiers meant to protect him, decided he wasn't worth protecting anymore. He was cut down in the Roman Forum, and his head, according to grim tradition, ended up being paraded around like a trophy. Rome's first post-Nero experiment in leadership lasted about as long as a bad New Year's resolution. Enter Otho, and if Galba's downfall felt fast, Otho's entire reign feels like it happened during a commercial break. He'd been part of the plot against Galba. He seized power with the enthusiastic backing of the same Praetorian Guard that had just murdered his predecessor, and he barely had time to settle into the job before another contender came marching toward Rome with an army at his back. That contender was Vitellius, commanding the legions stationed along the Rhine, and the two men's forces collided at the First Battle of Bedriacum in northern Italy. Otho's side lost. Rather than drag the conflict out, or risk more Roman blood being spilled over what was rapidly becoming a game of imperial musical chairs, Otho took his own life. He'd worn the purple for roughly 3 months. If Galba proved that discipline without payoffs gets you killed, Otho proved that even ambition without staying power gets you buried. Neither one is exactly a masterclass in stability, and Rome was about to get its 3rd lesson of the year in exactly how unstable the whole system had become. That brings us to Vitellius, the man whose name has survived largely wrapped in insults about his stomach. Ancient sources, particularly the ones written by authors who had every reason to dunk on a defeated emperor after the fact, love describing him as an absurd glutton, a man who supposedly ate 4 extravagant meals a day and treated warfare as an inconvenient interruption to dinner. The image is vivid, it's memorable, and it's exactly the kind of detail that survives centuries because it's fun to repeat. But strip away the mockery for a second and look at what Vitellius was actually dealing with. He inherited an empire mid-collapse, commanded soldiers who'd already demonstrated they'd murder an emperor without much hesitation, and had to somehow project strength, while Rome's other legions, this time out of the eastern provinces, were already lining up behind yet another rival. Calling him lazy or purely hedonistic ignores the fact that a purely lazy man doesn't usually survive long enough to become emperor in a year when 3 other men already got violently removed from the job. That said, gluttony wasn't his only reputation, and the cruelty accusations deserve more attention than they usually get. Sources describe Vitellius allowing brutal treatment of enemies and rivals, tolerating extreme violence from his own soldiers as they moved through Italy, and doing little to rein in the kind of chaos that turned civil war into open pillaging. Some of this is almost certainly exaggerated by later historians eager to paint every loser of 69 CE as a monster in hindsight, because that's a pattern you'll notice again and again in Roman historiography. The winners get statues and the losers get character assassinations dressed up as biography. But even accounting for bias, there's a difference between exaggeration and invention out of thin air. And enough independent testimony survives to suggest Vitellius wasn't some misunderstood softy either. He was a soldier emperor, trying to hold power through spectacle and indulgence at the exact moment Rome had lost patience with both. His reign lasted only about 8 months, ending when Vespasian's forces, backed by the Eastern legions and a much stronger claim to competent leadership, marched on Rome and crushed what remained of Vitellius's support. What happened next reads less like the fall of an emperor and more like a horror story. Vitellius reportedly tried to hide, was dragged out, humiliated, tortured, and eventually killed by an enraged mob before his body was thrown into the Tiber. Rome, in the span of a single chaotic year, had now watched 3 emperors die violently, one by assassination, one by suicide, one by mob execution, and if you're keeping score, that's not exactly a strong argument for the empire's political stability. So what actually broke here? It wasn't just bad luck, or 4 uniquely terrible men colliding at the worst possible moment. It was Rome discovering, in the harshest way imaginable, that its entire system of succession had never been properly designed in the first place. Augustus had built an empire that ran on the illusion of republican continuity, while quietly resting all real power on personal loyalty, army payrolls, and the Senate's willingness to rubber stamp whoever held the most force. As long as there was a stable bloodline and reasonably competent leadership sitting at the top, that illusion held together fine. But the moment that bloodline vanished, the mask came off completely, and what Rome was left staring at was the truth it had been avoiding for a century. The empire belonged to whoever could buy or intimidate the largest army into backing them. That's the real horror story hiding underneath the surface-level chaos of 69 CE, more unsettling in some ways than any single act of cruelty from Nero or Caligula. This wasn't one deranged individual abusing power. This was the system itself, exposed as fundamentally fragile, entirely dependent on the goodwill of soldiers who could be bought, unbought, and rebought within months. Galba's discipline collapsed under financial resentment. Otho's ambition collapsed under battlefield defeat. Vitellius's indulgence collapsed under a stronger rival, and a public that had run out of patience for any of it. 3 different men, 3 different approaches, and all 3 ended in violent death within a single calendar year. And here's the uncomfortable pattern worth carrying forward into everything still ahead in this story. Rome would eventually stabilize under Vespasian and the Flavian dynasty, sure. But the underlying weakness the year of 4 emperors exposed never actually got fixed. It just got papered over, generation after generation, waiting for the next succession crisis to rip the illusion open all over again. Every emperor who follows from here inherits that same fragile foundation, that same dependency on armies and loyalty that could evaporate overnight, and that same terrifying truth Rome learned in 69 CE, that the difference between an emperor and a corpse in the Forum was sometimes measured in nothing more than a few unpaid bonuses and a couple of disgruntled legions. Think about what that actually meant on the ground, not just in the history books but in the tents and barracks where soldiers actually lived. A legionary in 69 CE didn't wake up thinking about constitutional theory or the mos maiorum. He woke up thinking about his pay, his rations, and whether the man wearing the purple that week could actually deliver either. Vitellius understood this instinctively, which is exactly why his reign became a rolling banquet paid for with money the treasury didn't have, why his soldiers gorged on delicacies shipped in from across the empire, while the granaries back home quietly emptied. It worked, for a while the way bribery always works for a while. Then the bill came due, as it always does, and Vespasian's legions, hungrier and considerably less drunk, simply walked in and took what Vitellius could no longer afford to protect. That's the real inheritance every subsequent Caesar picked up, whether they wanted it or not. Not a throne exactly, more like a loaded transaction that reset every time a new army decided it liked someone else's face on the coinage better. Domitian would learn this the hard way decades later, cut down by his own household staff after years of paranoid purges. Commodus would learn it wrestling in the arena while the praetorians plotted behind him. The names change, the decades roll forward, the toga gets swapped for whatever the next century's fashion happened to be, but the mechanism stays eerily identical. Power in Rome was never really inherited, it was rented, month to month, from men holding sharp objects, and 69 CE was simply the year the invoice finally arrived stamped in blood. Picture a man who insisted on being addressed as Lord and God while he was still very much alive, who required senators to grovel through elaborate protocols just to enter a room he was sitting in, and who somehow managed to make an already jumpy aristocracy even jumpier than it had been under Nero. That's Domitian, the younger son of Vespasian, the guy who inherited the Flavian throne in 81 CE after his brother Titus died suspiciously young, and who spent the next 15 years turning imperial paranoia into something like an administrative philosophy, where Tiberius brooded on Capri and Caligula improvised his cruelty on the fly. Domitian built control into the architecture of the state itself, layering informants into every level of Roman public life until nobody, senator or slave, could be entirely sure who was listening. He didn't invent surveillance in Rome. Informers had been cashing in on the Maiesta's laws since Tiberius's day. But Domitian scaled the whole operation up into something closer to an industry. Delatores, those professional accusers who made a living turning suspicion into profit, thrived under his reign the way mold thrives in a damp basement. Dinner parties became minefields. A joke told after too much wine could resurface weeks later in a treason trial, twisted just enough to sound like sedition. Cassius Dio and Suetonius, our two main sources here, both agree on the broad texture even where they disagree on specifics, and that texture is unmistakably one of dread. You didn't need to actually conspire against Domitian to end up dead. You just needed someone to say you did, and someone was always willing to say it, because the emperor rewarded accusations the way other rulers rewarded military victories. The Senate, meanwhile, existed in a state of low-grade terror, dressed up as ceremonial respect. Domitian revived and weaponized treason trials, with a consistency that made Tiberius look almost restrained by comparison, and the body count among the senatorial class climbed steadily through the 80s and into the 90s CE. Flavius Sabinus, a cousin, executed. Multiple senators of consular rank, executed or exiled on charges that ranged from vague disloyalty to literally nothing verifiable at all. The historian Tacitus, who lived through this period and later wrote about it with the particular bitterness of a survivor, described a Senate reduced to performing loyalty while quietly terrified for its own survival. Every session a careful theatre where the wrong facial expression could get you a visit from the praetorians. That's not hyperbole for dramatic effect. That's a first-hand account from a man who sat in that room and watched colleagues disappear. And here's where Domitian gets genuinely strange, even by imperial standards. He wasn't content with mere political dominance. He wanted cosmic dominance too. He insisted on the title Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, official language that previous emperors had mostly avoided using about themselves while still breathing, preferring to let deification happen posthumously if the Senate felt generous. Domitian skipped the waiting period. He rebuilt the Capitol with lavish golden statuary of himself. He expanded the imperial cult in ways that made even loyal Romans uncomfortable, and he demanded a level of ceremonial submission that turned every audience with him into something closer to worship than governance. For an aristocracy raised on the fiction that the emperor was merely first among equals, princeps rather than king, this was an open provocation. It told the Senate exactly where it stood, which was somewhere far beneath him, kneeling. Inside the palace itself, the atmosphere curdled into something almost claustrophobic. Domitian, according to Suetonius, had the walls of his private walkways lined with reflective stones specifically so he could see anyone approaching from behind, a detail that sounds almost comically paranoid, until you remember that his own father and brother had died under circumstances that were, at minimum, convenient for somebody. He trusted almost no one by the end. Cycling through praetorian prefects and freedman advisors, purging even loyal staff on the thinnest suspicion, creating exactly the kind of vacuum where genuine conspiracy eventually starts looking like the only rational move left. When the walls of your own house are designed to catch assassins in the reflection, you've already told everyone around you what you think of them, and eventually they start believing it right back. The purges weren't random cruelty for its own sake, though, or at least not purely. They followed a grim internal logic. Domitian used treason trials as demonstrations, public reminders that dissent, real or imagined, carried a fatal price tag. Executions functioned as theatre in their own right. Less spectacular than Nero's burning gardens or Caligula's staged humiliations, but arguably more chilling precisely because of how bureaucratic they became. A formal charge, a formal trial, a formal verdict, and then a body, the machinery of Roman law, dressed up and deployed as an instrument of pure intimidation. It's one thing to fear a tyrant's temper, it's another to fear his paperwork. By the mid-90s CE, the walls were closing in from every direction, and Domitian seemed to sense it even as he kept tightening his grip. More senators executed, more property confiscated, more informants rewarded, the cycle feeding itself in exactly the way these cycles always do, until something finally snaps. And in September of 96 CE, it snapped inside his own bedroom. A conspiracy involving court officials, his own wife Domitia Longina according to some accounts, and members of his household staff who had simply run out of alternatives, cornered him, and stabbed him to death. The irony writes itself. A man who mirrored his hallways to watch for assassins behind him was killed by the people standing right beside him, the ones he was supposed to trust, because he had no one else left to trust. The Senate's response afterward tells you almost everything you need to know about how thoroughly Domitian had burned through their patience. They didn't just accept his death, they celebrated it, and then they did something Rome reserved for its most despised rulers. They passed damnatio memoria, a formal condemnation of memory, ordering his name chiseled off monuments, his statues melted down or decapitated, his arches and inscriptions systematically erased across the empire. It's a genuinely unsettling thing to witness even 2,000 years later, walking through the archaeological record and finding the gaps where Domitian's name used to be, the recut stone where his face used to sit atop someone else's more politically convenient head. But here's the uncomfortable question worth sitting with before we move on. Damnatio memoria doesn't just punish a dead emperor, it also flattens the historical record into whatever narrative his enemies found most convenient to leave behind. The same Senate that erased his name is also the class that supplied most of our surviving written sources about him. Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny, all writing in the aftermath, all with obvious motive to paint the worst possible picture of a man who had terrorized their own social class for over a decade. None of that excuses the purges or the trials. The evidence for those is too consistent and too specific to dismiss as pure fabrication. But it does mean the version of Domitian we've inherited was curated by the very people he'd spent 15 years trying to intimidate into silence. And erased history has an uncomfortable habit of getting rewritten by whoever survives to hold the chisel. Think about what that actually means in practice. Suetonius, writing under Trajan and Hadrian, had every incentive to make Domitian look like a monster, because doing so made the new regime look like salvation by comparison. That's not exactly an unbiased press release. Historians today still argue over how much of the Reign of Terror narrative was genuine and how much was political spin dressed up as biography, and the honest answer is probably both, tangled together so tightly you'd need a time machine to separate them cleanly. And that's the pattern you'll keep running into with every emperor on this list. The sources aren't neutral. They're written by survivors, by senators who outlived the purges, by court insiders settling old scores decades after the bodies were cold, which means every psychopathic Caesar we talk about from here forward comes to us filtered through people who had every reason to make him look worse, or in rarer cases, strangely better than he actually was. Keep that in the back of your mind as we move forward, because the next name on this list didn't just get erased from the stone. He got turned into a punchline, a cautionary tale so exaggerated that separating the man from the myth requires picking through some of the strangest, most theatrical propaganda the ancient world ever produced. Marcus Aurelius spent 19 years writing what would become one of the most quoted philosophy books in human history, jotting down meditations on duty and discipline between military campaigns on the frozen Danube frontier. He handed his son an empire that was, by any reasonable standard, in good working order, stable borders, functioning bureaucracy, a Senate that still believed its opinion mattered. Commodus took one look at that inheritance and decided what Rome really needed was a costume change. He was 18 when he became sole emperor in 180 CE, and within a few years he'd rebranded the entire city after himself, renaming Rome Colonia Commodiana and renaming the months of the calendar to match his own multiplying honorific titles. Picture waking up one morning and being told that August is now called something like Commodus the Magnificent Month, and you start to get a sense of the scale of the ego we're dealing with here. This wasn't subtle self-promotion. This was a man rewriting the Roman calendar, because his own name apparently wasn't everywhere enough already. But renaming months was just the opening act. The real spectacle, the thing that made Commodus infamous even by the standards of a family tree already stocked with unhinged rulers, was what he did in the arena. He didn't just watch gladiatorial games from the safety of the imperial box like every emperor before him. He climbed down into the sand and fought. Cassius Dio, who was actually sitting in the Senate benches watching this unfold in real time, describes Commodus taking on wounded and terrified animals, ostriches, lions, an elephant reportedly among them, and dispatching them with showy, theatrical flourishes designed to draw gasps from the crowd. He claimed the title of Rome's greatest gladiator, fighting under names like Hercules, styling himself as a literal reincarnation of the demigod, complete with a lion skin and club to complete the cosplay. Here's where we have to pump the brakes a little, because some of the wilder claims floating around about Commodus deserve scrutiny before we swallow them whole. Was he really fighting fully armed gladiators in genuinely lethal combat, risking his life like any other combatant in the arena? Almost certainly not. His opponents were typically maimed, restrained, or so mismatched that his victories were about as suspenseful as a boxing match against a man with his hands tied behind his back. Dio himself, who watched some of these performances from uncomfortably close range, makes it clear the fights were rigged for spectacle rather than genuine risk. So the sensational version, Emperor as fearless warrior facing real mortal danger, is mostly theatre. The documented version, Emperor humiliating the dignity of his office by performing as a paid entertainer while forcing senators to foot enormous bills for the privilege of applauding him, is arguably more damning anyway, because at least a genuine warrior emperor might have earned some grudging respect. This was something closer to a very expensive, very dangerous cosplay convention that the entire Roman elite was legally required to attend and pretend to enjoy. And attending wasn't optional, not if you valued your neck. Dio describes the agonizing calculus every senator faced sitting in that arena, forced to watch their emperor play gladiator while maintaining an expression of appropriate awe, rather than the horror or amusement they actually felt. Laugh at the wrong moment, look unimpressed at the wrong moment, and you risked being noticed by a man who controlled whether you lived to see tomorrow. Dio even admits to chewing on laurel leaves from his wreath to physically disguise his own facial expression. A small, almost absurd detail that tells you everything about how thoroughly Commodus had turned political theatre into a survival test for Rome's ruling class. Favoritism ran just as wild behind the scenes. Commodus handed enormous influence to praetorian prefects and palace freedmen who curried his favour, most infamously a man named Cleander, who effectively ran the administrative machinery of empire, while the emperor busied himself with costume changes and animal slaughter. Offices got sold, loyalty got bought, and the actual governance of Rome increasingly became something that happened around the emperor rather than through him. Naturally, a lot of people wanted him dead, and they kept trying. The first serious attempt came remarkably early, in 182 CE, orchestrated by his own sister Lucilla, who resented losing status after Commodus's rise, and conspired with a group of senators to have him assassinated. The plot failed when the would-be assassin, according to the sources, got theatrical about it, announcing his intentions with a dramatic flourish instead of just doing the deed, giving the guards enough time to intervene. Lucilla was exiled and later executed, but the attempt cracked something open in Commodus that never really closed again. From that point forward, his reign tilted hard into paranoid countermeasures, purges of anyone with a plausible motive or a suspicious face, and an ever-tightening circle of trusted enforcers who themselves became targets of his suspicion the moment their usefulness expired. Cleander himself, the freedman who'd run half the empire on Commodus's behalf, was eventually thrown to an angry mob during a grain shortage crisis, a sacrificial offering to public rage that conveniently let the emperor dodge blame for his own administration's failures. That grain shortage wasn't an isolated hiccup either. It was a symptom of something much larger rotting underneath all the gladiatorial theatre. While Commodus busied himself with arena performances and calendar rebranding, the actual machinery of running an empire, the tax collection, the provincial oversight, the military discipline along vulnerable frontiers, got starved of attention and competent leadership. Money that should have gone toward infrastructure or defense increasingly funneled into games, donatives, and the enormous personal cult Commodus was building around his own image. It's the same pattern you'll see repeat itself later in this list. Personal excess doesn't stay personal for long. It bleeds outward into institutional decay, into under-maintained frontiers and undersupplied cities, until the gap between the emperor's self-image and the empire's actual condition becomes impossible to paper over. By the end, the paranoia and the neglect converged into exactly the kind of crisis that had toppled emperors before him. In late 192 CE, a conspiracy formed inside his own household, allegedly involving his mistress Marcia, his chamberlain Eclectus, and the Praetorian prefect Quintus Aemilius Latus, the very people closest to him, the ones who'd watched the mask slip in private for years. The plan was poison first, administered in his food. When that failed to finish the job cleanly, they sent in a wrestler named Narcissus to strangle him in his bath. It's a strangely fitting end for a man who'd spent his reign performing physical combat for applause, killed not in the arena he loved, but in the most private, unheroic room in the palace, by someone whose job was ironically adjacent to the very athletic spectacle Commodus had built his public identity around. The Senate, unsurprisingly, wasted no time afterward declaring him a public enemy and erasing what honors they could, before Roman historians got to work cementing his reputation for posterity. Cassius Dio, writing as a direct eyewitness to the reign, and later the Historia Augusta, with its usual appetite for embellishment, both framed Commodus's death as the moment Rome's fortunes visibly turned, the hinge point separating the so-called golden age of the 5 good emperors from the long, slow instability that followed. That's a tidy narrative, maybe a little too tidy, but it's not hard to see why they reached for it. When your father spends his life writing meditations on stoic duty, and you spend yours slaughtering ostriches in a lion costume for spare change from the treasury, history is going to notice the contrast, and it's going to make sure everyone else notices it too. And yet, strip away the moralizing tone of ancient historians for a second, and Commodus starts to look less like a singular monster and more like a preview screening for a pattern Rome would repeat with alarming regularity. He wasn't the first emperor to confuse the throne with a personal stage, and he certainly wasn't the last to mistake fear for loyalty. What made him uniquely dangerous wasn't just the vanity or the cruelty on their own. It was how casually he fused them together, treating the empire itself as an audience that owed him applause. That particular delusion, the idea that absolute power should also come with absolute admiration, would resurface again and again in the centuries ahead, sometimes dressed up in different costumes, but never quite as literally as it had been in the arena, drenched in ostrich blood under Commodus's own delighted eye. Two brothers shared a throne the way two dogs share a bone, which is to say they didn't, not really, not for one single peaceful day. Caracalla and Geta had been co-emperors since childhood, propped up side by their father Septimius Severus like a matching pair of ceremonial vases nobody actually wanted to use. Severus ruled with Caracalla officially at his side from 198 CE, grooming both sons for power because that's what a dying dynasty does when it's terrified of civil war. It doubles down on the succession plan, instead of picking one heir and moving on. The problem is you can split a throne on paper, but you cannot split contempt, and by the time Severus died campaigning in Britain in 211, His two sons hated each other with the kind of intensity usually reserved for rival gladiators, not siblings who'd grown up eating dinner at the same table. The empire now technically belonged to both of them equally, which lasted about as long as you'd expect two furious young men with armies to obey them and a father no longer around to referee. Palace guards had to be doubled, doorways had to be watched, food had to be tasted, because everyone in Rome understood exactly where this was heading. It wasn't a question of if, only when, and Caracalla, ever the man of decisive and brutal action, decided the when was going to be on his own terms. According to the accounts that survive, he arranged a meeting under the pretense of reconciliation, staged through their mother Julia Domna, the one person both brothers still trusted enough to sit in a room with. Geta walked in expecting a peace conference. He got assassins instead, and he died in his mother's arms, stabbed to death by soldiers loyal to his brother, in a scene so intimate and so savage that ancient writers struggled to find anything comparable in the annals of Roman family drama. And that's genuinely saying something given the annals of Roman family drama. What happened next is where Caracalla's cruelty stops being a rumor and starts being policy. He didn't just eliminate his brother, he tried to eliminate the memory of him, ordering the systematic erasure of Geta's name and image from monuments, coins, and public records across the empire, a purge so thorough that modern historians still find scraped-off inscriptions where Geta's name used to sit, like a scar left on stone. Anyone suspected of mourning him, associating with him, or simply existing in his old social circle became a liability, and Caracalla moved through the aftermath executing perceived allies of his dead brother by the thousands according to some ancient tallies, a number almost certainly inflated by hostile sources but grounded in a real and documented purge nonetheless. This is the part of the story where you start to see the shape of the pattern this series keeps circling back to. Because Caracalla didn't stop with Geta's inner circle, he turned on his own household staff, on tutors, on soldiers who'd once guarded his brother, on essentially anyone whose loyalty history might one day question. Fratricide, it turns out, has a way of generating its own aftershocks for years. And yet, here's the contradiction that makes Caracalla genuinely difficult to file neatly into the villain category. In 212 CE, roughly a year after wading through his own family's blood, he issued the Constitutio Antoniniana, a legal reform that extended Roman citizenship to nearly every free person living within the empire's borders. This wasn't a minor administrative tweak. For centuries, citizenship had been a privilege, a status symbol carved out through military service, political favor, or the slow grinding wheel of provincial promotion. Caracalla essentially threw the doors open, and while the ancient sources bicker about his motives, whether it was genuine reform or a cynical scheme to widen the tax base by making more people liable for inheritance duties, the practical effect reshaped Roman identity for generations. He also poured enormous sums into the military, raising soldiers' pay and greenlighting massive construction projects, the Baths of Caracalla among them, a leisure complex so vast it could apparently hold over 1,000 bathers at once, marble halls built on the same treasury that had funded purges. Tyrant and reformer, murderer and modernizer, sometimes history refuses to hand you a clean answer, and Caracalla is Exhibit 1 for why that refusal matters. He met his own end in 217 CE, stabbed by a soldier while relieving himself on the road near Carrhae in Mesopotamia, undone not by a grand conspiracy of senators, but by a resentful guardsman acting on the orders of a man who'd been quietly circling the throne for months. That man was Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect, and his story is basically a masterclass in how fast Roman power could change hands when the right soldier held the right grudge. Macrinus became emperor almost by default, the senior official standing closest to the body when Caracalla fell, and he spent his brief reign trying to legitimize a claim that had been built on nothing sturdier than proximity and timing. He wasn't of noble blood, wasn't from a storied family, and the soldiers who'd elevated him started wondering fairly quickly whether they'd made a mistake, especially once Caracalla's own relatives began plotting their comeback. Macrinus lasted barely 14 months before being defeated in battle and executed in 218, a reign so short it barely leaves fingerprints on the historical record, but it tells you everything about how imperial succession actually worked by this point. Legitimacy wasn't inherited, it was rented. moment to moment, from whichever legion happened to be paying attention that week. Which brings us to Elagabalus, a teenager thrust onto the throne by his grandmother's political maneuvering, and whose 4-year reign became one long ancient scandal machine. He arrived in Rome in 218 with a foreign sun god in tow, literally installing the deity Elagabal at the center of Roman religious life, and reportedly forcing senators to watch him perform ecstatic ritual dances in its honor, a move that read as either genuine devotion or calculated provocation, depending entirely on which historian you trust. The sources, and it's worth flagging just how unreliable some of them are here, particularly the Historia Augusta with its love of lurid gossip, claim he married a Vestal virgin in violation of one of Rome's oldest religious taboos, staged elaborate banquets built entirely around cruel practical jokes on his guests, and surrounded himself with favorites chosen for reasons that had nothing to do with competence. Whether every detail is true matters less than what the accusations reveal. A court elite absolutely desperate to paint this young emperor as dangerously, embarrassingly foreign to Roman values. A useful narrative if you happen to be planning his replacement. And someone was planning exactly that. His own grandmother, Julia Maesa, having lost patience with a grandson she could no longer control or protect from his own worst instincts, shifted her backing toward his cousin Severus Alexander instead. Elagabalus was assassinated in 222 CE by the Praetorian Guard. His body reportedly dragged through the streets and dumped into the Tiber, the same river that had swallowed Vitellius over a century earlier, Rome apparently recycling its disposal methods for failed emperors. It's a brutal end dressed up in scandalous prose, but strip away the salacious detail, and what's left is a familiar Severan pattern. A young ruler destabilizing the old guard's comfort just enough to get quietly removed. 3 emperors, 1 dynasty, and a body count that makes clear the throne itself had become the most dangerous seat in the empire, not despite the bloodline, but because of it. Take Caracalla, the eldest of the trio, whose reign began not with a coronation, but with a murder inside his own mother's embrace. Geta, his younger brother and supposed co-emperor, was cut down by centurions in his mother's arms, bleeding out on Julia Domina's lap while she reportedly tried to shield him with her own hands. Caracalla didn't stop there. He ordered a purge that swept through the Roman elite like a scythe, executing an estimated 20,000 people in Rome alone. Senators, soldiers, freedmen, anyone who had ever smiled at Geta or dined at his table. It's the kind of body count that makes Elagabalus's scandalous banquets look almost quaint by comparison. And yet Caracalla is remembered today for baths, the enormous echoing complex that still draws tourists snapping photos among the ruins. A monument to leisure built by a man who treated human life as disposable as bathwater. That's the unsettling magic trick of Roman propaganda and posterity working together. Marble outlasts memory, and grandeur has a way of scrubbing blood off the record. The year is 235 CE, and for the first time in Roman history, a man who never set foot inside a senatorial villa, never wore the toga of a magistrate, never so much as sipped wine at a patrician dinner party, is standing where emperors are supposed to stand. Maximinus Thrax was a soldier through and through, a giant of a man by ancient accounts, allegedly towering over 8 feet tall according to sources that clearly never met a tape measure or cared much for accuracy. Strip away the exaggeration, and what remains is still remarkable. A career built entirely on muscle, discipline, and battlefield instinct, rather than bloodline or Senate favor. He clawed his way up through the ranks of the legions until the army itself simply decided he should be emperor. And just like that, the old rules about who got to wear the purple evaporated. The Senate, predictably, was horrified. Here was a man they considered a barbarian in a soldier's boots, ruling an empire that had always, at least in theory, belonged to the aristocracy. That horror bleeds through every surviving account of his reign, and it's worth pausing on that fact before taking any of it at face value. The Historia Augusta, never exactly a beacon of restraint, paints Maximinus as a monster who despised the educated classes and delighted in crushing them, and Herodian isn't much kinder. But remember who's writing this. These are senatorial voices describing a man who represented everything they feared, power flowing not from birth or pedigree, but from calloused hands and army loyalty. Of course he reads like a villain in their pages. That doesn't mean the purges didn't happen, and they almost certainly did. Aristocrats and officials swept aside on suspicion of disloyalty. Executions carried out with the kind of efficiency you'd expect from a man who spent his life issuing orders rather than debating them in committee. But it does mean we should read the body count alongside the bias, because a hostile elite describing the destruction of its own class was never going to write a balanced account. What's harder to dismiss is the sheer relentlessness of his campaigning. Maximinus spent almost his entire 3-year reign on the frontier, pushing back against Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube, with a ferocity that kept the borders from collapsing entirely. Was this brutality for its own sake, or a soldier emperor doing exactly what the empire desperately needed, someone who understood war because he'd lived it, rather than read about it in a scroll? Probably both, honestly. He never returned to Rome, never courted the Senate's affection, and that absence cost him everything. In 238 CE, his own troops turned on him during a siege gone wrong, killing him and his son, and handing the throne to men the Senate found more palatable. It's a brutal irony that the empire's most battle-hardened ruler in years was undone not by an enemy army, but by his own exhausted soldiers, tired of a war that never seemed to end. And here's where the crisis really shows its teeth. Because 238 CE didn't just claim Maximinus, it devoured an entire caste of would-be emperors in a single chaotic year. A bloodbath so absurd historians simply call it the Year of the Six Emperors, Rome apparently developing a taste for mass casualties in its leadership. Which brings us to Philip the Arab, a man whose path to power reads less like a coronation and more like a crime scene report. Philip rose to prominence as Praetorian prefect under Emperor Gordian III during a grueling campaign against Persia, and when Gordian died in 244 CE, under circumstances that remained suspiciously convenient for Philip's career trajectory, guess who ended up wearing the purple? Ancient sources whisper that Philip orchestrated the young emperor's death. Though, as always with this era, whispers are about the best evidence we're going to get. What's not in dispute is that Philip needed to move fast to legitimize himself, striking a hurried and humiliating peace with Persia just to buy himself breathing room back home. A deal that cost Rome both treasure and pride, but kept his throne intact for the moment. He spent lavishly on games and celebrations, including Rome's 1000th anniversary in 248 CE, a spectacle clearly designed to paper over the fact that his claim to power rested on shaky, blood-soaked foundations. It didn't work forever. By 249 CE, a rival general named Decius had the army's backing, and Philip died in the resulting clash, another emperor consumed by the very system of military loyalty that had made him. Decius didn't get to enjoy his prize for long, but he made his mark fast, and not in a way that's aged well by modern standards. Believing that the empire's mounting disasters, invasions, plague, economic strain, stemmed from divine displeasure, Decius issued an edict in 250 CE requiring citizens across the empire to publicly sacrifice to the traditional Roman gods, and Christians who refused faced persecution ranging from property seizure to execution. It was less a targeted religious crusade and more a desperate bureaucratic attempt to restore what he saw as cosmic order through forced conformity, a ruler trying to control chaos he couldn't otherwise explain. Whether cynical or sincere, the policy caused real suffering, and it fits a broader pattern of the era. Emperors reaching for extreme measures because the ordinary tools of governance no longer seemed sufficient against the scale of the crisis. Decius met his end the way so many 3rd century emperors did, not through poison in a palace or a conspiracy of senators, but on a battlefield, killed in 251 CE fighting the Goths in a swamp in modern Bulgaria. His body reportedly never recovered, swallowed by the very terrain he'd tried to conquer. He became the first Roman emperor to die in battle against a foreign enemy, and that single grim fact says more about the 3rd century than any account of his character ever could. This wasn't an age where emperors worried primarily about scheming rivals in marble corridors. This was an age where the barbarians were at the gates, quite literally, and the throne itself had become a battlefield posting with unusually good clothing, which is really the point worth sitting with as this chapter closes. Maximinus, Philip, Decius, 3 men, 3 violent rises, 3 violent ends, and none of them individually monstrous enough to explain the pattern on their own. What we're looking at isn't a gallery of uniquely cruel tyrants stacking atrocities for shock value. It's a systemic collapse, an empire so stretched by invasion, plague, and economic freefall that the imperial office itself became a magnet for assassination, a job nobody could hold long enough to actually govern. Sources hostile to soldier emperors love to frame each one as uniquely brutal, uniquely illegitimate, uniquely doomed, but line them up together and a different story emerges, one where the real villain isn't any single ruler but the impossible position they were all shoved into. Rome in the 3rd century wasn't being run so much as it was being fought over, year after bloody year, and the men who briefly held the purple were less tyrants by nature than symptoms of an empire in genuine structural freefall. And if you want a snapshot of just how absurd that freefall got, look at the sheer turnover rate. Between Maximinus Thrax and the eventual stabilization under Diocletian, Rome burns through more emperors than a modern startup burns through interns, most of them lasting months, a few lasting mere weeks, one or two barely long enough to get their face stamped onto a coin, before the coin itself became a collector's item for entirely the wrong reasons. This is the so-called crisis of the 3rd century, and calling it a crisis almost undersells it, because a crisis implies an endpoint, a moment where things get bad and then, mercifully, stop being bad. This was 50 years of the empire treating catastrophe as a permanent operating condition, plague sweeping through crowded garrison towns, harvests failing under overtaxed provinces, and the currency itself getting so debased that Roman coins went from silver to what was essentially shiny bronze with delusions of grandeur. Picture the average legionary during this stretch, not as a conqueror kicking down doors in some far-flung province, but as an exhausted, underpaid, chronically anxious man, watching his commanding officer get murdered every other year by the guy 2 tents down. Loyalty in that world wasn't a virtue, it was a liability. You pledged yourself to an emperor knowing full well that pledge had the shelf life of unrefrigerated milk, and that whoever replaced him might remember exactly who cheered loudest for the last guy. Survival meant political amnesia, meant learning to forget allegiances as fast as you formed them, meant treating regime change the way modern office workers treat a new manager, with polite nodding and an internal countdown to the next inevitable shake-up. And this is where the psychopath label starts to wobble under its own weight. It's tempting, deeply tempting, to look at Maximinus butchering senators or Decius doubling down on persecution while Gothic warbands roasted his border provinces, and slap a clinical diagnosis on men who lived and died 1,000 years before anyone coined the term. But psychopathy as a concept describes an individual wired for cruelty regardless of circumstance. Someone who'd be dangerous whether he was born a peasant or a prince. What Rome's 3rd century actually produced was something scarier in its own way. Ordinary, ambitious men, no more inherently monstrous than the guy running your local council, dropped into a system that rewarded paranoia, ruthlessness, and rapid violence as basic survival skills. Take away the empire's collapsing infrastructure, and half these men probably die as forgettable provincial officers, remembered by no one, guilty of nothing more dramatic than petty corruption and bad manners at dinner parties. That's the uncomfortable pivot this whole era forces on us. We want our tyrants to be uniquely evil because it's simpler, because it lets us close the book and say, well, that was a bad one, moving on. But the 3rd century doesn't let you close the book that easily. It keeps handing you men who started out as capable, even talented, administrators and soldiers, and watched the imperial machinery itself grind their better instincts into paste, which raises the far more unsettling question waiting in the wings. Because if the system built murderers out of ordinary men accidentally, what happens when a man who was already inclined toward cruelty gets handed that same purple robe on purpose? By the time Aurelian took the throne in 270 CE, the Roman Empire wasn't so much a single country as 3 separate countries wearing a trench coat and pretending to be one. Gaul had broken off into its own breakaway state. The East had fallen under the control of Palmyra and its formidable queen Zenobia, and the actual Roman heartland was left holding a currency worth less than the metal it was stamped on. Aurelian's job, essentially, was to walk into a house fire holding a bucket and somehow leave the place standing. And to his enormous credit, he did it, earning himself the title Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world, which is the kind of nickname you only get by doing something genuinely extraordinary. Here's the catch, though. Restoring an empire that had spent decades tearing itself apart wasn't a gentle process of diplomacy and shared picnics. Aurelian crushed the Gallic Empire, marched east, and eventually captured Zenobia herself, ending the Palmyrene rebellion in what should have been a triumphant, tidy resolution. Except when Palmyra rose up again shortly after, Aurelian's response wasn't measured. Ancient accounts describe the city being sacked with brutal thoroughness, its population slaughtered or scattered, its wealth stripped down to the studs. This is the same pattern we've seen again and again in this series. A leader praised for stability, while the fine print reveals the stability was purchased with someone else's blood. Aurelian also enforced military discipline so severe his own soldiers reportedly nicknamed him Hand on Hilt, which is not the nickname of a guy running a relaxed, forgiving command structure. He was eventually assassinated by officers in 275, allegedly after being tricked into believing his own life was in danger, proof that even the man who stitched the empire back together couldn't stitch closed the paranoia baked into the throne itself. So was Aurelian a restorer, or a tyrant with excellent PR? Honestly, probably both, which is the uncomfortable answer this entire series keeps circling back to. He genuinely saved Rome from disintegration. He also did it using the exact same toolkit of terror, mass execution, and citywide punishment that defines every bad emperor we've covered so far. The difference wasn't method, it was outcome. And history has a nasty habit of forgiving methods when the outcome looks good enough on paper. Then along comes Diocletian in 284, inheriting an empire that Aurelian had barely kept from splitting at the seams, and deciding the solution wasn't just fixing Rome, but redesigning the entire operating system. Diocletian split the empire into 4 administrative zones under a system called the Tetrarchy, essentially 4 rulers sharing power across 2 senior emperors and 2 junior successors, an arrangement engineered specifically to prevent the endless assassination churn of the 3rd century. It actually worked, for a while, which honestly makes Diocletian one of the more competent administrators in this entire lineup. He overhauled taxation, reorganized provinces, and tried to stabilize prices with the Edict on Maximum Prices, an attempt at economic control so ambitious it basically invented Roman inflation policy on the fly. But competence and cruelty were never mutually exclusive in Rome, and Diocletian proved that with brutal clarity through the Great Persecution beginning in 303 CE. Christian communities across the empire were targeted through a series of edicts demanding the destruction of scripture, the seizure of church property, and the arrest of clergy who refused to perform pagan sacrifice. Refusal could mean torture, forced labor in mines, or execution, carried out with the same bureaucratic efficiency Diocletian applied to tax codes. This wasn't chaotic mob violence, it was policy, methodical and empire-wide, which somehow makes it more chilling rather than less. The man who fixed Rome's administrative machinery used that exact same machinery to grind down a religious minority with terrifying precision. And standing right beside Diocletian through most of this was Maximian, his co-emperor in the West, the guy who handled the muscle while Diocletian handled the paperwork. Maximian was competent in battle and ruthless in enforcement, but his real legacy is a masterclass in refusing to stay retired. When Diocletian orchestrated a mutual abdication in 305, forcing both senior emperors to step down simultaneously in the name of a smooth, planned succession, Maximian went along with it on the surface. Then he immediately started scheming his way back into power, first attempting to manipulate his son Maxentius's rise, then trying to reclaim the throne directly, then allying with his son-in-law Constantine, then betraying Constantine too. It's less a political career at this point, and more a soap opera with a body count. Maximian's repeated comebacks eventually collapsed for good in 310, when he was cornered, forced into suicide, and quietly erased from the official narrative his former allies preferred to tell. The Tetrarchy, that beautifully engineered system meant to end succession chaos forever, couldn't even survive one of its own founding members refusing to accept retirement. Put these 3 reigns side by side, and a pattern emerges that's honestly more disturbing than any single mad emperor we've covered so far. Aurelian, Diocletian, and Maximian weren't unstable. impulsive rulers driven by personal cruelty for its own sake. They were organized, capable men running an organized, capable state, and they used that organization to carry out violence on a scale the impulsive tyrants could only dream of. Aurelian's discipline flattened rebellious cities. Diocletian's bureaucracy turned religious persecution into a functioning government program. Maximian's ambition turned an entire succession system into a decade-long power struggle soaked in family betrayal. None of them fit neatly into the psychopathic emperor mold we've been testing throughout this series, because their violence wasn't personal, it was procedural. It came stamped with committee approval and administrative logic, and in some ways that should scare you more, because it wasn't a broken man wielding unchecked power. It was a functioning system deciding that mass suffering was simply the cost of doing business. And that's really the uncomfortable thesis these three reigns leave us with. We've spent this series asking whether specific individuals were cruel enough, paranoid enough, violent enough to earn the label psychopath. But Aurelian, Diocletian, and Maximian force a different question entirely, one about institutions rather than individuals. What happens when the state itself becomes the psychopath? When cruelty stops being a personality flaw and becomes bureaucratic policy, stamped, filed, and enforced with the same calm efficiency as a tax collection? Rome had just spent 50 years being ruled by chaos. What it built to replace that chaos was, in its own quiet, terrifying way, something far more effective at inflicting suffering than any single deranged emperor ever managed alone. Take Diocletian's edict on maximum prices, for instance, a document that reads less like an economic policy and more like a threat wrapped in Latin legalese. Break the price ceiling on eggs or wool, and you weren't fined, you were executed. The punishment for a market vendor charging too much for a chicken was, quite literally, death, and the edict says so in plain, unblinking language, carved into stone and nailed up in marketplaces across the empire, so nobody could claim ignorance. That's not the unpredictable rage of a Caligula deciding on a whim who lives and who dies. That's a spreadsheet with a death penalty attached to every line item, and somehow that calculated quality makes it colder, not warmer, than any single act of individual madness. And then there's the census, an innovation so mundane it barely gets a mention in most textbooks, yet it reshaped the lives of ordinary Romans more thoroughly than any battlefield massacre ever could. Diocletian's tax reforms tied peasants to the land they worked, generation after generation, turning free farmers into something dangerously close to hereditary serfs, all in the name of predictable revenue. Nobody had to be paranoid or bloodthirsty to make that happen. You just needed clerks, ledgers, and the quiet assumption that human beings were, above all else, taxable units. The suffering that followed, families locked into poverty for decades, entire villages unable to leave the soil their grandparents were registered on, never needed a villain's face attached to it. It just needed forms, filed correctly, in triplicate. The Great Persecution fits the same chilling pattern. Diocletian didn't personally hunt down Christians in the streets with a sword, the way legend loves to imagine tyrants doing. Instead, he issued edicts, 4 of them between 303 and 304, each one escalating the bureaucratic noose a little tighter. First, churches were to be demolished and scriptures burned. Then, clergy were to be imprisoned. Then, imprisoned clergy were to be forced into sacrifice under torture. And finally, the edict widened to include every Christian in the empire, ordering universal sacrifice to the old gods, or death. Provincial governors carried out the details, local officials filled in the paperwork, and executioners simply followed orders that had been debated and drafted far above their heads. It was violence with a chain of custody, cruelty you could trace through official channels like a receipt. Constantine didn't just win a civil war, he weaponized it into a legend. By the time he marched into Rome in 312 CE, having supposedly seen a cross of light in the sky before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he'd already spent years grinding down rivals with the same cold calculation any successful warlord needs. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber fleeing that battle, his body fished out and beheaded for public display, because nothing says divinely favored ruler quite like parading your enemy's severed head through the streets. Licinius, his last major competitor for control of the empire, got the more drawn-out treatment. Defeated in battle, promised safety, then executed anyway in 325 once he'd stopped being useful alive. Convenient timing that, almost like the promises were never meant to survive contact with victory. But here's where Constantine's story gets genuinely uncomfortable, the part that doesn't fit neatly into the stained glass version of history. In 326, his eldest son Crispus, a capable and popular military commander who'd fought well for his father, was suddenly arrested and executed on charges that ancient sources can't even agree on. Treason, maybe. Adultery with his stepmother, maybe. Nobody really knows, because the official record goes strangely quiet right when you'd want it to get loud. And it doesn't stop there. Shortly after, Constantine's wife Fausta, Crispus's stepmother, and the woman at the center of whatever scandal supposedly triggered his death, also died under mysterious circumstances, possibly suffocated in an overheated bath on her husband's orders. One son, one wife, both gone within months, and the emperor, who just months earlier had been having visions of divine favor, apparently felt no need to explain himself to anyone. This is the tension that sits right at the heart of Constantine's legacy, and it's a tension the history books have spent 17 centuries trying to smooth over, because Constantine didn't just convert to Christianity, he became the emperor who legalized it, funded it, and eventually got baptized on his deathbed, which meant that generations of Christian historians writing after him had a very strong incentive to polish every rough edge off his biography. Eusebius, his most enthusiastic chronicler, practically writes hagiography instead of history, framing Constantine as a chosen instrument of God, while conveniently skating past the murdered son and the dead wife like they're footnotes nobody needs to read. Separating the actual man from the myth he became is like trying to find the original photograph underneath 50 layers of restoration paint. Somewhere under all that reverence is a ruthless political operator who eliminated family members the same way he eliminated rivals, efficiently and without much apparent hesitation. His son Constantius too inherited the throne in 337, and he inherited something else too, an appetite for clearing the family tree of anyone who might complicate his claim. Almost immediately after Constantine's death, a purge swept through the extended family, and it wasn't subtle. Uncles, cousins, half-brothers, the list of relatives who conveniently died in the chaos surrounding the succession reads less like a tragic accident and more like a checklist. 2 of Constantius's uncles were killed outright, along with several cousins, leaving only a couple of very young relatives alive, presumably because killing toddlers was a bridge even this dynasty wasn't ready to cross yet. The pattern established by the father, quietly executing threats to consolidate power, was inherited by the son with barely a pause for grief. Constantius too ruled for over 2 decades, and his court became a masterclass in paranoia dressed up as piety. He was deeply invested in the theological controversies tearing through Christianity at the time, particularly the fight over Arianism, and he wasn't shy about using imperial power to enforce his preferred version of doctrine, exiling bishops who disagreed and treating religious conformity as a matter of state security. Ancient historians, particularly the pagan writer Ammianus Marcellinus, painted him as suspicious to the point of tyranny, someone who saw conspiracies in every shadow of the palace and responded with the same swift, permanent solutions his father favored. Whether that reputation is entirely fair or partly the bitterness of a writer who resented Christian influence in government is genuinely hard to untangle, but the body count among his own relatives speaks for itself regardless of who's doing the narrating. And here's the uncomfortable through line that connects this entire family saga to something much bigger. Dynastic murder wasn't an aberration in Rome, it was practically a job requirement, and centuries after Constantine first turned his own household into a crime scene, the pattern was still playing out on repeat. Fast forward to 602 CE, and you land on Phocas, a low-ranking army officer who rode a military mutiny straight into the imperial palace by overthrowing and executing Emperor Maurus, along with Maurus's sons, in a purge that set the tone for everything that followed. Phocas didn't inherit an empire. He seized one through violence, and then governed through more of the same, filling his reign with executions of anyone who looked like a threat, real or imagined. His paranoia curdled into outright brutality, and predictably it caught up with him. In 610, another usurper, Heraclius, arrived by sea, and Phocas met an end that was less execution than public butchery, reportedly mutilated before being killed, his body dragged through the streets as a final humiliation. Phocas isn't part of the Constantinian bloodline, but he's absolutely part of the same story, a late, brutal echo of a pattern that had been running through Roman power for centuries by that point. Kill your way to the throne. Rule through fear because fear is faster than legitimacy, and eventually somebody else does the exact same thing to you. From Constantine quietly erasing his own son and wife under the shadow of his new Christian empire, to Constantius purging uncles and cousins to secure a crown he hadn't earned through merit, to Phocas closing out this entire era with a reign built on slaughter and ending in exactly the kind of violent spectacle he'd inflicted on others, the through line never really breaks. Rome kept building new institutions, new religions, new justifications for power, but the oldest instinct in the empire, seize it, hold it, kill for it, never actually went away. It just kept finding new faces to wear. And here's the thing that makes this particular chapter of Rome so unsettling to sit with. None of these men thought of themselves as monsters. Constantine believed he was building something eternal. Constantius believed he was protecting a fragile empire from the wolves circling it, even if he had to become one himself to do it. Phocas, in whatever twisted logic ran through his head in that final decade, probably believed the throne was simply his to take because he'd taken it, and that alone made him worthy of it. That's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Psychopathy in the ancient world rarely announced itself with a villain's monologue. It wore the language of duty, of necessity, of divine favor, right up until the moment the knife came out or the mob showed up at the door. Power didn't corrupt these men so much as it revealed what had been sitting underneath the purple robes the entire time, patient and waiting for its opening. "20 reigns, 7 centuries. And by now, if you've been paying attention, you've probably noticed the same 5 or 6 gears turning underneath almost every single one of these stories. An informant network that rewards betrayal with cash and status. A purge that starts with a few dangerous men and ends with hundreds, sometimes thousands of corpses. A family member who becomes the single greatest threat to your survival simply by existing and sharing your bloodline. And finally, waiting in the wings the entire time, an army that can make you emperor on a Tuesday and unmake you by Friday if the payroll runs late. That's not 20 separate personality disorders. That's one operating system, running on repeat, generation after generation, wearing different faces and different names. And that's really the thing worth sitting with before we close the book on this whole saga. These weren't 20 isolated monsters who each happened to stumble into power. This was a structure, a machine built by Augustus that never actually solved its own core problem, which was that Roman power was never secured by law. It was secured by loyalty, and loyalty is rentable, biddable, and endlessly renegotiable. Every emperor we've covered, from Tiberius brooding on Capri to Phocas dragged through the streets of Constantinople, inherited that same fundamentally unstable machine. Some of them ran it competently for a while, some of them ran it straight into a wall. But none of them escaped its basic gravity, because the gravity wasn't personal, it was structural. Now, before we hand out any final verdicts, let's do the responsible thing one more time, because this entire series has hinged on it. Almost everything juicy you've heard about these men came filtered through people who had every reason to make them look worse than they probably were. Suetonius wrote decades after the fact, collecting gossip like a magpie collecting shiny objects. Tacitus wrote as a senator settling scores with an institution that had terrorized his own class. The Historia Augusta, frankly, reads less like history and more like ancient tabloid fiction, with just enough real names sprinkled in to seem credible. Cassius Dio at least had the decency to admit when he was speculating. So when we call someone paranoid or cruel, we have to keep asking the boring but essential question: is this administrative record, coin issues, laws, building projects, or is this a colourful anecdote written by someone who wanted you to hate the guy? Caracalla is maybe the cleanest example of why this distinction matters. Yes, He had his own brother Geta murdered in their mother's arms. And yes, he unleashed a purge that swallowed up an estimated 20,000 people who'd had the misfortune of being Geta's friends, acquaintances, or simply unlucky enough to be nearby. That's not legend. That's about as close to verified as ancient history gets. But that same reign also produced the Constitutio Antoniniana, a decree that handed citizenship to nearly every free person inside the empire's borders, an administrative earthquake, not a rumor, cruelty and competence, sitting right next to each other in the same man, in the same year. Rome rarely gave you a clean villain. It gave you contradictions wearing a crown, which brings us to a question that's been quietly humming underneath this entire series. Why do we all know Caligula's name, and Nero's name, and Commodus's name, while Philip the Arab, or Decius, or even Maximian barely register outside of specialist textbooks, despite arguably comparable body counts? Part of it is spectacle. Nero performing while Rome burned, Commodus fighting disabled animals in the arena dressed as Hercules. These are cinematic images, built for retelling, built for legend. Part of it is timing. Die in a chaotic stretch where 5 other emperors are also dying, and you just become one entry in a very crowded obituary column. And part of it, uncomfortably, is who got to write your obituary in the first place. The emperors remembered as monsters are often simply the ones whose enemies happen to be better writers, or who happen to offend the specific class of people holding the pens. Strip away the theatrics, though, and what's actually left is less a story about ancient madness and more a story about what unmonitored, unchecked power tends to do to any human being, in any century, given enough time and enough opportunity. We've deliberately avoided slapping modern psychiatric labels onto men who lived 2,000 years before those labels existed, because that's a shortcut that flatters our own era's vocabulary more than it explains theirs. What the record actually shows, again and again, is something simpler and somehow more uncomfortable. Give one person total authority, remove the checks, remove the accountability, and stack an army's loyalty behind their whims, and paranoia stops being a personality quirk. It becomes a survival strategy. Cruelty stops being an aberration. It becomes a management tool. That's not a Roman disease. That's a human one, and Rome just happened to run the experiment longer and with better documentation than almost anyone else in history. So here's the final frame, the one worth carrying with you as the lights dim on this whole 20-emperor odyssey. Tiberius and his informants, Sejanus and his letter, Caligula and his bridge of boats, Nero and his burning city, Domitian and his mirrored hallways, watching for knives that eventually found him anyway, Commodus in the arena, Caracalla in his brother's blood, Elagabalus in the Tiber, Diocletian's bureaucrats quietly persecuting with paperwork instead of swords, Constantine erasing his own son, Phocas dragged through the streets he once terrorized. None of these men saw themselves as villains in their own story. Each one believed, in whatever twisted internal logic power allows a person to build, that the throne demanded exactly what they gave it. And maybe that's the real horror underneath all of this. Quieter than any assassination, any purge, any burning city, it was never really about one bad emperor, or 2, or 20. It was about a system that kept handing absolute power to fallible human beings, and then acting surprised every single time something monstrous walked out the other side. Rome eventually fell. Its emperors came and went. Its purple robes changed shoulders more times than anyone could count. But that particular lesson about what unchecked power reveals in people rather than what it corrupts never really expired. It just went quiet for a while, waiting, the way it always does, for the next open